The phone buzzed against my nightstand at midnight, and I knew before I even looked at the screen that it was my mother. Because she was the only person who considered midnight a perfectly reasonable hour to start a conversation. "You can come to the Hendersons' dinner tomorrow for your sister's engagement," she said, skipping past hello entirely, "but I need you to behave yourself. Her father-in-law is a name partner at one of the biggest firms in Calgary. Do not bring up anything from the past." I sat up against my pillows in the dark, the cold of the room finally registering now that I was awake enough to feel it. "Behave myself how exactly? You know how?" Her voice had that clipped, rehearsed quality it got whenever she was managing a situation rather than having a conversation. "Just smile, be polite, and don't make this about you." I didn't bother asking what this was supposed to be about, because I already knew the answer was always going to be my younger sister, and I was always going to be the variable nobody could predict. I told her fine, hung up, and lay back down listening to the furnace click on somewhere below me, turning over the particular tiredness that comes from being 32 years old and still being spoken to like a teenager who might embarrass the family if left unsupervised. My sister Joelle had been dating Bradley Sinclair for almost 2 years before he finally proposed over the summer, and from the moment the ring photos hit our family group chat, our mother had been operating like a campaign manager preparing for a debate. Bradley's father, Graham Sinclair, was a senior partner at a downtown law firm, the kind of man whose name showed up in business section profiles and charity gala photos, the kind of man my mother referred to in a hushed, slightly breathless tone usually reserved for royalty. I had met him exactly once, at a brief engagement party back in July, for maybe 15 minutes, most of which my mother spent positioned slightly in front of me like a screen. I wasn't hurt by that, not anymore. I'd long since gotten used to being the family's wild card, the one who didn't fit the narrative they preferred to tell about themselves. No husband, no house in the suburbs with a finished basement, no job anyone wanted to ask follow-up questions about at Thanksgiving. Just me, a one-bedroom apartment near the Beltline, and a quiet government contract job that nobody at family functions had shown the slightest curiosity about in 6 years. The dinner was held at a private dining room above a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting, white tablecloths, and a level of quiet that made you feel like you should be whispering even before anyone told you to. I wore a simple charcoal dress, low heels, hair down and plain, because anything more put together than that tended to read as me trying to compete for attention I wasn't supposed to want. My mother met me at the coat check with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, took my arm like she was escorting cargo, and walked me toward our table, murmuring instructions under her breath the entire way. "Smile. Don't bring up your job. Let your sister have her night." I nodded along because the simplest way through an evening like that one was to make myself as small and forgettable as possible, and let Joelle have the spotlight she'd clearly been waiting her whole life for. And to be fair, she looked genuinely happy, glowing in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids, and for a few minutes I let myself just be glad for her without complicating it with anything else. Bradley's mother was kind, warmer than I expected, and Graham Sinclair, when he finally arrived a few minutes late from a meeting that had apparently run long, shook my hand with a polite, distracted firmness before his attention moved on to more important guests. I made small talk with cousins I only half recognized, nodded through stories about Joelle's new condo, and drank exactly one glass of wine because my mother's eyes kept finding mine across the table like she was keeping me on a short leash from a distance. Then the toast started. Graham stood up near the end of the meal, tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the whole table turned toward him, the way rooms naturally turn toward people who are used to being listened to. He started warmly enough, talking about how proud he was of his son, how impressed he'd been by Joelle's kindness and intelligence, how two families coming together meant something real, and the table leaned in, charmed, nodding along. And then his eyes moved past Bradley, past Joelle, past my mother's expectant, frozen smile and landed on me. He stopped mid-sentence. Not a stumble, not a dramatic pause for effect. A full stop, the kind that makes a room shift in its seats without quite understanding why yet. He set his wineglass down slowly on the white tablecloth and took a few steps around the table toward where I was sitting, and I swear every single conversation in that private room died at once, like someone had reached over and turned the volume all the way down. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin so hard I actually heard the fabric crease. Joelle's smile faltered, confused, her eyes darting between me and her future father-in-law, like she was trying to figure out what scene she'd accidentally wandered into. Graham stopped in front of me, studying my face the way you study something you're trying to place from a long time ago, something filed under a name you weren't sure you'd ever need again. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, but it still carried, "but I know you. I'm trying to place from where." I felt my pulse pick up, steady but quick, the way it used to before a hearing I knew was going to be difficult. I set my glass down carefully because my hands were calmer than I expected them to be. "I'm Marianne," I said. "Joelle's sister." It wasn't the answer he was looking for, and we both knew it. He tilted his head, slightly, and then something shifted behind his eyes, recognition arriving all at once like a name surfacing out of deep water. "Marianne Lockhart," he said slowly, deliberately, using my full name in a way that made my mother actually flinch. "You argued the Whitcomb arbitration 3 years ago. Pro bono, through the legal clinic on 9th Avenue. He said it plainly, without any theater at all, the way people speak when they're stating a fact rather than performing one. "You're the reason my niece kept custody of her kids. I sat in that courtroom every single day. I never forgot your face." The room went so silent I could hear ice shifting in someone's glass 2 tables over. My mother's napkin slid off her lap onto the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. I hadn't expected this room to ever know any of that. I'd left the clinic 2 years earlier for reasons that were mine alone, taken a quieter contract role drafting policy briefs that nobody at family dinners had ever once asked me about, and let everyone keep believing in the version of me that was easiest to write off. It wasn't shame exactly. It was more that explaining myself to people who'd already decided who I was felt like throwing a stone into a lake that had frozen over years ago. My mother liked her version of our family clean and simple. Joelle the success story, me the cautionary footnote, the unpredictable one she had to manage at events like this, so I wouldn't say the wrong thing or remind anyone that I existed outside her narrative. "You told me not to embarrass you tonight," I said, turning toward her, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, calm in that particular way you learn to be calm once panic stops being useful to you. So I didn't say anything. Around the table, relatives who'd spent the whole evening glancing past me, like part of the centerpiece arrangement, were now watching with a different kind of attention, the rapid mental math of people realizing they'd badly misjudged where the actual respect in the room belonged. Joelle's hand had gone to her chest, looking at Graham with something between confusion and a slow, dawning understanding. Bradley hadn't said a word, but his eyes had gone glassy, like 6 years of half-truths about me were rearranging themselves behind them all at once. Graham turned to address the table, and his voice carried the same easy authority it had during his toast, except now there was real weight behind it that hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. "I don't embarrass easily," he said. "But I'll tell you what does. Watching a family undervalue someone who has done more good in this city than most people in this room will ever know about." He looked directly at my mother when he said it, not cruelly, but without softening it either. The way people who've spent decades giving honest assessments under pressure simply don't know how to do anything else. My mother opened her mouth to respond and found nothing there. I watched her run out of script for what I think was the first time in my entire life. Bradley found me later, near the quiet end of the room, away from the murmuring and the recalibrated glances. He didn't make a big production of it. He just stood there for a second, then asked quietly why I'd never told him, and I told him the truth, that there hadn't seemed to be room for it, that the version of me everyone had already agreed on didn't leave space for the real one to exist. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're absorbing something they should have asked about years ago, and told me he was proud of me, which I think was the first time anyone in that family had said those words to me and actually meant them. My mother caught up with me near the coat check as I was leaving, her composure rebuilt but visibly thinner now, like a wall patched together in a hurry. She started in about how I should have told her, how she would have handled things differently if she'd known, and I just shook my head. Because that was exactly the problem. My worth in her eyes had always depended on what I could offer to be seen, never on simply being her daughter. "You don't get to be proud of this now," I said quietly. "You spent 6 years deciding I wasn't worth asking about. That's not on me to fix tonight." She didn't have an answer for that either. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I said goodnight, pulled my coat tighter against the wind coming off the river, and walked out into the cold Calgary air feeling lighter than I had in years. The particular kind of light that comes from finally letting a room see you exactly as you are, instead of the smaller, dimmer version you'd quietly agreed to perform for people who never once thought to ask.